Welcome to the next to the last live conversation piece for this the season, but the last of the jazz series this year. Mm-hmm. And to bring this live tonight, I'd like to turn it over to Rodney Whittenberg. Please.
Hey everybody, welcome, and my guest Arturo O'Farrill. And if some of you got to listen to the podcasts that we did, we're going to delve into a little deeper into some of those things that we talked about. And so let's get started. My first question for you is, so in the podcast we talked about your childhood and that you started playing piano when you were 6 and how you first discovered jazz by sneaking into your dad's music collection. But my question for you today is, when did you first become aware that your parents were celebrities or legendary musicians, and how did that affect you when you were beginning to learn how to play? What was that like to go, wow, how do I do this?
It's funny. I'm not really sure that. I think the word celebrity should be attached to a jazz arranger.
Okay. I'll go along with that.
It's a little, no, and it's not, but I knew they were bigger than life because there were some very strange gatherings at my house with very strange guests who I didn't know were famous. Mm-hmm. I didn't know who Dizzy was, but he was there, and he was really strange. And John Hendricks was there, and he was really strange. Mm-hmm. In fact, I'll tell you a little story about John Hendricks. My mother and father were both really strange people. My father was the quiet one. My mother definitely is a very strange lady. She's very, very magical. And I remember I went up to John Hendricks at one of these parties because I was 12 years old and I was into Lambert Hendricks and Ross, and I went up to John and I said, "Man, I'm such a fan, blah, 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 gush, 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 gush." And he looked at me and he went, "The 12th revolution of the Saturnian planet is in direct violation of the Aquarian understanding of the 13th house of the 7th. And I went, "Whoa." I said, "Okay, Mr. Hendricks, nice meeting you." Next thing I know, I see John with my mother in some corner of the apartment, and they're at it, man. They are talking. It's like an hour later, he comes up to me and goes, "Man, your mother's really weird."
So he thought your mother was weird.
He thought my mother was weird. But magical people have that skill. Mm-hmm. They have the skill of confusing and dazzling you without even trying. Yeah. And I think that more than celebrityhood was the thing that I noticed growing up, was that there were a lot of magical people in my sphere, in my world. There's people like Machito and Mario Bausá, who scared the shit out of me because he smoked cigars and gesticulated wildly. So you're like a little kid, and this cat's in this big cigar going, and I'm like, oh, so he's scared he was going to hit me.
Did you grasp what they were talking about? The philosophy, the politics, the musical conversations? Did you have an understanding that some deep stuff was going down in the conversations?
I didn't really get the idea that my father was an important contributor till I was already a musician. I was already touring and playing with Carla Bley. Mm-hmm. And somebody came up to me and said, "Have you listened to the Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite?" And I said, "No." And they said, "You better check this out." and this is historical music. Mm-hmm. And it's not just because Charlie Parker plays on it, it's because the composition itself is unlike anything that exists until that point in the genre, and very different from Duke Ellington's large suites. Mm-hmm. So it of course it's different. It's very mambo aware and clave specific, and very and then I thought to myself, yeah, my father's a heavy. And the thing that happened when I realized it is that there's a nice feeling to know that because your dad is your dad, man. He farts, he gets drunk or whatever. Like all parents do. Yeah. And you look at them and you're like, wow, yeah. My sister and I used to call our parents the Bunions, which I'm sure my kids do now. So I'd have no problem with this.
And I'm guessing because they had bunions. that what you call
No,
them?
they just, that's like, like just a way of saying, oh, here's your parents. Just like, everybody feels that way. Nobody wants to admit it sometimes, but everybody looks at their parents and goes, oh, you gosh. And the weird, it's funny because my wife and I were talking yesterday about how your friends always like your parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Even though you don't understand them,
Yeah.
your friends are always like, man, your parents are so cool. And you're like, my parents? We're not talking about the same people, are we?
So speaking of your dad, another thing you talked about, which I loved in the podcast, was your dad's ritual. He did every day around 5:30, and the impact that had on you. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, at about 5 o'clock, the house would grow silent of domestic and day-to-day chatter. And my father would make himself a big glass of scotch and soda, and he would sit in front of the stereo system and listen. And he wasn't, it's like a lot of people use music like wallpaper. They put it on in the background, it affirms whatever they want affirmed. It's just there to remind them they're good or whatever. My father would sit and listen. He would sit in abject silence and just listen. Just listen. I mean, he'd sit there in front of the speakers like this. And he would do this for an hour or two. And he listened to everything. He listened to Shostakovich. He listened to music. I didn't, I had no idea what classical, contemporary, avant-garde music was, but he would listen to music that just sounded like people in pain. And then he would turn around and listen to Oscar Peterson. Same sitting, he'd go from Ligeti to Oscar Peterson, from Oscar, and he did the same from Oscar Peterson to Beethoven. And he did this every night, and that's, I realized that you can't really be a musician if you're not a fan. If you don't love this thing, it's crazy. Because it's a real sacrifice.
Yeah. Do you do that?
I do.
Do you make time to listen to music?
I do. I sit down and listen to music, and I listen to. I got that from my dad. Today. I was listening to Bob Marley. I was listening to Bob Marley, and then some Johann Sebastian Bach. And I do that a lot. I listen to music. I fell in love with I think he's Tunisian. Brother named Dhafar Yusuf, who plays the oud. He's very well known in Europe, in Paris. And he does this thing that can only be called Islamic jazz. It's an incredible thing that he does. It uses all that language, and he plays with great jazz musicians. And it's so beautiful, because to me, there's one of the things we never talk a lot about is that circle, the Fertile Crescent, and where so much of the performance practice that bleeds down into the Western Africa and eventually makes its way to the New World, and to that nexus is so rich. Spanish, Moorish, North African thing is crazy, man. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And I swear that's where the roots of all our music comes from.
Yeah.
Africa, Northern Africa, Western Africa, Spanish, Moorish, that stuff, man, what? And I got turned on to this guy and just...
Like you can hear the Middle Eastern influence on flamenco. It's like you can see just all the things going back and forth between...
It's funny, because I think a lot of it has to do with a concept that we've lost in our lives. And it's very, very African concept. It's the concept of not fixing yourself to finiteness. They do it in pitch. There's no pitch. It's like quarter tones, semi-quarter tones, tiny little micro 8 tones. It's like their pitches.
Yeah.
And the time is like, you know what I'm saying? We like to fix finite. We like to say the beat is here, the pitch is here, and this is how you play jazz, okay?
I was working on a project with Badal, who
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was a really complicated classical jazz piece, and he kept going, the music doesn't know where one is, just let's play. Yeah.
But we fear not being fixed to finiteness.
Mm-hmm.
We fear being cast adrift. But that's that's another story. That's another battle.
So tell me, and I find this so fascinating. So it's at Brooklyn College where you meet a history professor that really starts to open your mind up to the world outside of music. And I find it so fascinating because it seems like your house was this mecca of just really deep thinkers and just interesting characters that it took your teachers.
Yeah, but you know what it is that in your surroundings, even vastness can be dogma. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like you could be in the house of the deepest people on earth, and still it's your house. So for you, it's dogma. It's just close. That doesn't mean that's what I lived. I mean, my mother and father were really hip people. My mother's still alive, but they were really hip and smart and open people who cared about music and culture and their lives and their community and being the best that they could be. So that was a great lesson. But it wasn't. That's not what Teofilo Ruiz taught me. He was a American history professor at Brooklyn College whose specialty was Spanish Renaissance witchcraft, something really like academic. And but he changed my life because he made me question everything, and he made me question myself, and he even like, I mean, he said, don't believe what I say, don't believe what you read, double check everything, historical books, filter them through your perspective. Don't read the news, don't understand anything until you've checked it inside your soul, which I thought was like so revolutionary. He said, that there is the truth, and history is written by the winners and the people with the most money. Which I thought was like for a history professor to say that, it's ridiculous. And then he made the ultimate insult. He said, "Why do you play music?" I said, "What do you mean? What do I play?" He said, "Why do you play music? Well, to what end? To what purpose? Who? What? Why?" And I went, "I guess I wanted to get laid. I like to hang, whatever." But that really wasn't the reason. The reason that I play music is because I'm a communicator. And he made me realize that. He said, "You write well, you speak well, and there's a purpose to it." And I didn't know it at the time. I've been finding out my purpose in the past 10 years. But I knew it was more than just learning how to play A flat 7 sharp 13.
So, well, I had another question, but you just raised, so you said in the past 10 years, so what's been your journey in the past 10 years, and what is that purpose? Because I think that'll probably lead us right into your last record and the new record.
I started reading about gender and politics and wealth distribution in the United States, and it flipped me out. Racial relations, violence, and all of this came to a head when Ramarley Graham was killed. John Hayes just resigned. But when Ramarley Graham was killed by the NYPD, everything came to a head. And I realized that the reason that I do what I do is to speak what I feel about conditions in society today. Some people have taken great offense at my words, and I do apologize for that, but we live in a brutal, violent police age, and it's horrendous. And jazz musicians have grown strangely silent sometimes about the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and I think my purpose as an artist, as a musician, is to speak on these things and be clear about them and say, this is wrong, this is madness, call it for what it is. And I mean, it sometimes it seems hopeless, but that seems to be what engages my soul. And that when your soul is engaged is when you pour forth.
Right. Yeah. So that leads me to the conversation continues, Cuba, the conversation continues. So what was your inspiration? What made you decide to do this big work? And I mean, I have a couple questions for you. What made you decide to do it? And from a technical standpoint, why did you make it a live recording as opposed to a studio recording?
The conversation is not live. It's a studio recording.
Oh, it's a studio recording.
Yeah.
Okay, I read something that it was a live recording.
It was recorded. It might as well have been live because
Okay.
we recorded it in Cuba,
Mm-hmm.
and circumstances in Cuba are not sometimes state of the art.
Okay.
But I've been going to Cuba since 2002, and many of those years, it was not. It was legal to go, but it was not easy.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been going back and forth. And from the earliest voyages to Cuba, I realized that we're not getting the full story in the United States. And I saw a lot of lies that we were fed by the mainstream media and by the government about what life in Cuba is like. And the truth of the matter is that Cuban life is filled with hardworking people who make something out of nothing, who've discovered the joy of community, and who don't need immediate gratification sometimes. And they become these master musicians, master dancer, master artists, and they don't do it for the Blue Note recording contract. They don't do it for the limo ride. They don't do it. They just do it to be excellent. And I found that like so convicting. And so such a conviction of what we do sometimes in the United States, with, especially as young artists. We look for the pot of gold. We don't care about the art. And so sometimes, I started that idea of the conversation continues was to begin to engage American young musicians and Cuban young musicians in each other's lives so they would influence each other. The other thing about Cuba is that it's a very closed society, so a lot of the globalization of jazz textures was not entering. A lot of the free jazz, a lot of those Chicago school, a lot of that beautiful Afrocentric, angry jazz was not entering Cuba.
So they had evolved sort of from the
They kinda got us-
1950s.
Yeah, they kind of got it. They never got Anthony Braxton. They never got Cecil Taylor. They don't, and it's really, I don't know what, I don't know how you can call yourself a jazz musician or jazz fan without being conversant in all the languages. But so I started just kind of getting young people involved in each other's lives, bringing them here, taking them down there, and then my ultimate goal was to have a real collaborative. Every time a jazz musician went down to Cuba, it was to show off.
Yeah.
Was to show how great they swing and to be mystified by the Cubans and their crazy Afro-Cuban rhythms. And I thought that was really bullshit. I thought instead of going down there and showing them how to swing, we should go down there and ask them how to swing, firstly, secondly, and then enter into an equal relationship with them, where we invite them to teach us, we help them, we understand each other, and then we collaborate in a real meaningful way. So and I thought that's what Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo had begun to do when they engaged in each other's lives. And so I went down there with 6 composers, 3 American composers and 3 Cuban composers, and said to them, imagine what the conversation sounds like that is still taking place between Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo, because death, revolution, ideology does not kill progress. And right now on some cloud they're hanging at a bar and talking about the future of this music. And it's obviously an angelic bar. They're sitting there talking about this music, and they're discovering things about each other and about the roots, the African roots of this music that we still don't understand.
How did you pick the composers on both sides, the Cuban side and the American side?
I put out a wide call, and whoever responded and got involved in. That's not to say that everybody was called, but I'm saying I really love a lot of composers. I love Michelle Rosewoman. I asked. I love Alexis Vasquez. I asked a bunch of folks, and I got involved with Rudresh Mahantapa, who I invited to be my soloist. And,
Oh, wow.
you know, they were given a very simple, they were given that mission to take the conversation that is still going on and to realize it musically. Daphnis Prieto is a composer we've worked a lot with. He has composed for us several times.
Did you have them workshop stuff before they actually composed, or did you give them guidelines, or how did you facilitate so that they were engaged in the dialogue?
I met with them. We talked about textures, about rhythms. The only other kind of instruction I gave them was not to do the obvious, not to directly be Latin or directly be jazz, but to find that forward hybrid, that direction in which both elements of African music in the New World are realized.
And so at the same time you're also composing. So how did you decide? Did people compose more work than you actually used for the recording? And how did you pick what pieces that you?
Well, by the time we actually did the recording, we had to raise funds for payment of the commissions. So we actually got to the point where we knew exactly who was going to compose exactly what.
Okay.
So it got, by the time we were in the studio, certainly, there was not any question about. And a lot of the work that we ended up recording, I think we played in concert. So that I knew what it sounded like and I knew what it would look like. Okay. There were pieces we recorded which we couldn't release because they didn't turn out the way that I thought they should.
That is me too. My last question before I open it up to the audience for comments and questions. I was lucky enough to be at your recording session for your new record, and you're playing one of the pieces tonight. And I just spent a few hours there on that first day that you were there. We have a mutual friend named Kabir, and he's executive producing your new record? Yeah. And I was just struck by how difficult the music you write is. One of the things that always fascinates me, I love, is that when someone writes music that is not only, it's difficult, it's virtuosic, but it's still incredibly musical. Because I find sometimes people write virtuosic music and I go, okay, yeah, so, and you can play fast or you can play that complicated thing, but it's still very musical. But there was a section, or many sections in the piece that were just so hard to play. And I heard you just now going through the piece and I'm like, oh, he's killing it now. So what is that like for you when you write a piece of music that's too hard for even you to play? And how does that come about?
Well, if I write something that's too hard for me to play, I usually ask my wife to play it. She's the better pianist by far. No, but you know what it is? It's and we spoke a little bit about this. Yeah. It's not so much that music is hard, it's that it's different. And the musicians are used to being comfortable in a certain setting, and when you stretch them, they are uncomfortable. And I've had more than, this is one of the greatest compliments that I think a composer can get. Not, oh, that was so much fun to play, but thank you for stretching me. When they come up to you after the gig and after all those tears, and they say, thank you, that was important. Thank you for stretching my understanding of what this music is. That's the greatest compliment that you can possibly get. The other thing too is this dawned on me, this literally dawned on me. I was giving a composition lesson and I realized the aesthetic that guides my thinking. I want to write music that has a specific response in 3 different ages in your life. I want a 12-year-old to be able to go, oh man, that's so cool, listen to those sounds. Wow, man, that's so beautiful. Wow, that's fast, and that's slow, and it's doing this and it's doing that. I want a 30-year-old to go, oh, interesting use of polytonality and interesting use of metric modulation. I understand it. And I want an 80-year-old to listen to my music and go, oh, man, I remember that. That's my life. So if my music doesn't appeal to 12-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and 80-year-olds, I ain't.
And that is the goal of an artist. You want your work to speak on many different levels and to be able to revisit it and find something new in it. And
Well, you know what it is? It's the same. I've been reading this my whole life. What an artist wants to do is capture that which is uncapturable, to convey the essence of the transience of who we are and what we are, so that we can understand and accept with grace and dignity the infinite reality of who we are.
Yes, very true. So with that, we're going to open it up for some questions. We got a couple minutes left. Who has questions out there for our guests? Yes, yes.
I see you have a Birdland shirt on. Have you recently played there?
I actually have I've been playing at Birdland for over 23 years, 24 years, every Sunday. The Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra, and before that, my father's orchestra was in residence at Birdland. And as a matter of fact, they'll be there tomorrow, and next week, and the week after that. And we've been doing that for a long, long time.
Where was the most fun you had? Like, can you just name a place where you had just a blast off the top of your head? I'd love to go back there again and have another blast.
You know, I loved Indonesia when we played the Java Jazz Festival. I loved the food. I loved the experience. I just thought the people were really generous. It was a really wonderful experience playing in Indonesia. But I know this sounds really hack, but it's not. I almost always find a very rewarding experience wherever we play.
Any other questions? Yes.
What is your explanation for Afro-Cuban jazz? What does that actually mean? What does that actually mean?
That's a really good question. I think that I don't like those labels. I think that jazz began I think jazz is a word made up by somebody to sell seats. I think that's been proven. I think that the word jazz was first used in a poster. I think jazz is the spirit of, and this sounds really bizarre, I think the jazz is the spirit of overcoming tremendous oppression. The diaspora was a disaster on some levels, and it gave us some of the greatest moments in history. So I think jazz is a gift of Africa, a legacy of Africa, and the rhythms that you find in jazz, you find that kernel, that syncopation that is often reduced by musicologists to a triplet, that that permeates all the music of Africa and all the music of jazz. It's called swing in jazz, and it's called clave in Cuban music. So I think Afro-Cuban music is really the realization of a close walk with the roots of what we call jazz.
Any other questions?
I would like to ask about your album, Cuban Conversations, and what was the connection between, because I've listened to that album for many times, and it's an absolutely splendid album, and there's a lot of culture in there, but a lot of mixed music. Can you talk a little bit about some of the blendings of the Cuban music with, I believe what I was hearing was Mexican, some Mexican sounds, maybe percussion?
Yeah, I like to think that the definition of Latin jazz has grown beyond Cuba and has begun, and really it makes sense in terms of, again, it makes sense in terms of the diaspora, because African slaves were brought to Colombia and to Brazil and to places throughout the New World. And wherever those beautiful people came, they brought with them their incredible culture and music, and enriched the lives. And of course, some places they were not allowed to keep their music and their culture, but other places like Brazil and Cuba really encouraged them to keep their drums and their patterns and their culture. So to me, Latin jazz is Peruvian, it's Colombian, it's Ecuadorian, it's Argentinian. I mean, there's all kinds of flavors that we can think of that sound like Latin jazz. So I tried to expand at every step and turn the definition of Latin jazz to include all of the Americas, which I think is really important. We'll play a piece for you tonight called All of the Americas, and it's a festejo, which is a Colombian rhythm with a Peruvian rhythm with a Colombian maraca based on a very Pan-African djembe rhythm. So, you know what I mean? That to me is what we do. What we do best is kind of, I don't know, there's something in me that doesn't like walls. I don't like walls. I hate walls, man. I hate borders. I hate walls. I can't deal with it, man. Whenever I see a border or a border guard or a wall, whenever I see an immigration place or a customs, I just want to, no, y'all have no idea what life is about.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned your wife. She plays with you? You said
She's a classical pianist, and every now and then I've written things that I ought not to have written. And so she'll cover my ass. We give her credit on the album. It's not as if she doesn't get the credit, but I've written things that I should not have written. I don't mind admitting it either, because you know, it is. I am what I am, and it's all that I am.
Mm-hmm. Any last questions? Okay, let's give our guest a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.